Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Would love to hear name, pronouns, if you have an organizational affiliation, and any thoughts on how does building ownership help our communities and help movements build power. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here. My name is Ash Lynette, and I'm EBC's Director of Development. If this is your first time joining us at EBC, welcome. And for folks who have been with us a while, we see you and we thank you for being in community. I'd love to just start us off with some appreciations. First off, thank you to our partners at Bright Research Group, and particularly the authors of this case study, Bright Star Olson, Amina Elster, and Kristian Bedrossion. We also want to appreciate the Katali Foundation for sponsoring the report, and specifically Amaka Agbo and Jocelyn Wong for not only their support of this case study, but for the love and dreams that they have poured into this project since it was just the spark of a distant vision. And of course, I know there are folks on this call who have supported in many ways, from giving your time, treasure, and talent. You know who you are, and we are so, so deeply grateful to be in community with you. Um, we do have a short time together, so I'll go ahead and run us through the agenda. First, I'll offer some brief context and history of the Restore Oakland building and some highlights of what we've been able to accomplish over the past 5 years. And the bulk of our time today will be spent in conversation with 3 brilliant and powerful people who have supported Restore Oakland in this case study. So that's Kristian Bedrossion, Jocelyn Wong, and Zach Norris. In a recent conversation, Jocelyn said to me, if you know one capital campaign, you know one capital campaign. So our goal is that this case study can share a blueprint for what worked, where we stretched and learned, and offer ideas for how folks can build on what we gained throughout this process. It's not the end-all be-all resource, but hopefully one tool in the toolbox. In movement spaces, right, that we're often building the plane as we fly it, moving as fast as we can. And so we wanted to take time to reflect and share what we can so that this can be a resource to the community. At the end of the call, we'll share ways to stay connected and invite you to come celebrate Restore Oakland's 5th anniversary with a special party on October 1st. Okay, let's get into it. Cool. So at the Ella Baker Center, we believe in our communities and the real power we can build to overcome punitive policies that don't make us safer. We believe in our organizing power to transform systems of oppression and change the world we live in. And when we talk about ending systems of punishment and policing, we also have to have ideas for what replaces it. Our efforts can't solely focus on getting rid of prisons. We as a movement have to be prepared to answer the question of what comes next to genuinely repair harm when it inevitably happens. And, EBC has been using this framework for a long time, right? Books, not bars, jobs, not jails, etc. And we trust that we can find those solutions in community and understand that in order for people to push those victories, we need the space to come together and organize. So with all that in mind, I'd like to provide a little background on Restore Oakland before we dive into the case study. So the original founders of the building, Zach Norris and Saru Jayaraman, had a vision of how to build safer spaces for our communities, one where we could come together under one roof to dream, organize, and act. Restore Oakland aims to provide this solution rooted in community with the goal of development without displacement. And so this project began as a dream in 2015, an active capital campaign in 2016, and the reality of a physical building and community asset when we moved in 2019. Restore Oakland has a unique collaboration of organizational partners that supports both the community's immediate needs and long-term goals. Groups that operate within the building include Causa Justa, Just Cause, organizing around tenants' rights, Restore Oakland, Inc., a nonprofit that offers healing spaces with community members and funnels resources into local small businesses with BIPOC leadership, and of course, the Ella Baker Center, fighting to shift resources away from policing and prisons and back into our community. So in the first 8 months, when we were still open pre-pandemic, organizations in the building provided job training to over 250 community members, helped divert 26 youth from being funneled into the youth justice system, provided free space for over 200 community meetings, and incubated 2 community-led healing programs and 1 program for intergenerational leadership. And of course, we all know then the pandemic hit, right? And in March 2020, we had to make the difficult decision to close our doors to the public. And yet, despite these setbacks, Restore Oakland opened at the exact right time. No one knew that the pandemic of this scale was coming, but those 8 months of organizing and building connections with our neighbors meant that when it arrived, we were central to where we were needed most. Everyone in the building made rapid shifts to support the urgent needs in the community, mobilized neighbors to keep each other safe, and quickly organized to uplift local demands. And so over the past 5 years, we've proven that when we fight, we win. The organizations within the building have been able to leverage the space to accomplish tremendous victories, despite everything this wild time has thrown our way. And that includes, EBC, Restore Oakland, Inc., and our community partners, hosting regular mutual aid events in the parking lot, and we supported over 2,000 community members with urgent needs, including food, diapers, COVID safety kits, and school supplies. For EBC in particular, having a stable home has meant that we've been consistent. So when many of our incarcerated community members were getting moved around during the pandemic, we were able to be the place they always knew they could return to and always write to. Right. So as a result, we went from corresponding with 2,000 people inside in 2019 to now over 10,000 people, really strengthening our ability to organize and build power with folks inside. Additionally, over 400 people were able have been able to receive healing support each year through Restore Oakland, Inc.'s programs in the Peace Room. And over 350 people leverage Restore Oakland's meeting rooms to engage in movement work in 2022 alone. And so we see this number steadily growing as in-person organizing becomes more and more possible. Restore Oakland is intended to be a model for what happens when we actually shift away from punishment and prisons and invest in safety and economic opportunity instead. So this case study that we'll discuss today is the prequel, right? What happened before the doors opened and the hard-fought lessons learned as we developed and implemented the initial capital campaign. What started as a $2 million project grew to a $22 million project in just a few short years. And of course, many factors contributed to this. And that's part of why we created this case study, to reflect on the process and share lessons learned. I am so, so grateful for our panelists who are joining us today, some of whom have been integral to the project from day one, and in some cases, day -1, day 0, I don't know what you call it. Our folks will speak directly to the vision of what Restore Oakland is and how it came to be a reality. So first up, Kristian Bedrossion is an independent consultant and senior consultant with Bright Research Group and co-authored this case study with Bright Star Olson and Amina Elster. She was previously Executive Director at Community Works West. Zach Norris is the author of Defund Fear, was the co-founder of Justice for Families, and was the Executive Director of the Ella Baker Center during the first Restore Oakland capital campaign. He now serves as the California Climate Director at Greenpeace. And finally, Jocelyn Wong is the Director of Capacity Building at the Katali Foundation and has been rooted in the Bay Area movement work for over 15 years. After serving as EBC's Director of Development, they led the initial fundraising efforts for Restore Oakland as the Capital Campaign Director. Welcome, panelists. Really? Hey.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So our first question is for Zach. Zach, now it's been a few years since we launched the initial capital campaign. What would you highlight from the beginning stages of the Restore Oakland project that other organizations could benefit from? Before the shovel was picked up, what did you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to almost even imagine it now, but the mid 2010s were a time of bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform. And as you mentioned, the Ella Baker Center had worked to even make that possible in terms of people interested in changing our criminally unjust system through decades of organizing and fighting for books, not bars, healthcare and housing, not handcuffs, jobs, not jails. But for a lot of that time, we had been a lot stronger on the not jails and the not bars and the not handcuffs than we had in terms of what we actually wanted to see. And in 2014, we did a report called Who Pays the True Cost of Incarceration on Families with organizations across the country, including Forward Together based in the Bay Area. And people really spoke about the need for access to meaningful employment and economic opportunity, to restorative and transformative justice spaces when they're having conflict in community, and especially in the Bay Area, wanting to be able to stay in their communities and not be kind of gentrified out of them. And so we thought, what would it look like to create some of the elements of that vision of community safety in one place? And that's how kind of Restore Oakland came as an idea, a concept. And I think in terms of what we did, we did organizing really from the jump and tried to figure out who could be evangelists for this idea. How do we make connections? We connected with Deanna Van Buren at Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, and she had just done a landscape mapping of Oakland and saw how many different centers of criminalization there were versus really centers for healing, centers for economic opportunity, and map that across Oakland. And that really helped us identify, okay, well, how do we continue to build on the work that we have been doing in the Bay Area, but to do so in a much more rooted way. And so in addition to organizing, we also knew that we needed to kind of test the idea and to do so rigorously. So we conducted a feasibility study, really looking at what would it look like to have a space that housed nonprofit organizations, a space for transformative and restorative justice, a space for economic opportunity, a space for people to get information if they were dealing with housing issues in their community, being faced with eviction, for example. And we started to reach out to partners, including Causa Justa Just Cause and others, to really bring some of those elements into one space. And then the last thing we did was then just kind of share out that idea and hold different forums where we could get feedback and begin to take the next steps forward and identify, what would it look like to have a building? What would it cost? And we were wildly wrong in all of our estimations in terms of what those numbers would be. but that's a different part of the answer, and I'll stop there for now.
For sure. Thank you, Zach. Yeah. And it sounds like, you tried to do your homework. You're really organized. You really did the feasibility study, and still things happen. Um, Jocelyn, I'm curious to turn the next question to you. During this kind of intro time period or pre-campaign, what was the vision you presented to funders and donors? And what did you do to inspire them, get them on board with such a large fundraising project?
Thanks for this question, Ash. And thanks, Zach, for kind of laying the scene for what the conditions were like back in those mid 2010s. I think something that we talked a lot about at that time, Zach, too, was just the conditions that EBC itself as an organization had faced for so many years as an anchor organization in the East Bay that was constantly being pushed and bounced around due to the changing economic conditions and gentrification of the community. And so, one of the things that was happening around that time in those early days of dreaming up Restore Oakland was Uber had just purchased the old Sears building across the street at 20th and Broadway, where EBC was then located. And it really threw the neighborhood to the whims of real estate speculators and threatened not to only double our rent, but triple it. And so that was really like, yet another loud wake-up call, if you will, around really needing to think seriously about space and what it would mean and what it would take to remain in Oakland. And so that certainly wasn't lost on us as we were thinking about, the vision we were trying to work for on behalf of our base, on behalf of our community. That was a part of it, right? Just the operational future of Ella Baker Center. I think something else that was unique to that moment, Zach had returned to EBC as the executive director after an especially challenging period for the organization. EBC had gone through a period of successive leadership transitions, and I don't know if anybody on the call recalls this, but philanthropy kind of had a delayed fallout following the Great Recession. And so in the midst of the Great Recession, the 07, 08, 09, the dollars weren't going away. It was really in those mid 2010s, early 2010s, where grassroots organizations started to see their funding dwindle, if not disappear altogether. So the combination of those factors really put the organization on hard times. And meanwhile, again, zooming out to the greater kind of societal conditions, right? Black Lives Matter was coalescing from a rallying cry online and in the streets into an intersectional global movement. Zach mentioned the release of the Who Pays report, which illuminated the financial, emotional, and health cost that families, and in particular women and children of color, bear as it relates to having a loved one behind bars. And yet there was this kind of undeniable need and social opening to channel so much of that outrage and heartbreak over ongoing institutional violence against Black people and other folks of color into a fundamentally different and more positive vision for the future. Personally, I think back to that time, and I think people, myself included, having come from the ACLU prior, had enough of trying to make bad systems less bad through more conventional in-system strategies, and frankly, exclusively fighting the bad can be a slow, soul-sucking, and often devastating path. So, as you spoke to, Ash and Zach as well, I think on a heart level, on a soul level, I think many people at the time and still today needed to fight for something good, something liberatory, something that felt like freedom, something of our own making, something based in love, connection, community, belonging. you both spoke to this piece around, we had these really great alliterations and slogans, right? Care not cages, jobs not jails. We had a lot of good lines. But yes, again, I think EBC knew well and had a legacy around the not cages front of the fight, right? And for good reasons. There wasn't a lot of time, energy, and resources that we could pour into a vision or model that focused on the care front, right? And so I think there was a real longing for new solutions for community safety and belonging. And I think the proposal, the idea of Restore Oakland really spoke to that longing. And so that's the vision we went with. And I think in addition to the business feasibility study that Zach mentioned, we also did a capital campaign feasibility study, which helped us to test some of those early messages and to see how it landed with some of our folks and stakeholders. Everyone from grassroots donors, members of the organization, to some of our major individual donors and institutional funders. And so with that feedback, I think that allowed us to refine some of the messaging, and that was what really lent a lot of strength to the further refinement of the visions, plans, and offerings of Restore Oakland. So, I think one by one from that point on, just having a two-way conversation where we're collecting feedback and input while still advancing and refining a clear vision, we were able to grow the universe of people who saw a future worth fighting for and worth giving to in Restore Oakland. Yeah, but I would say, in addition to the fundraising, I think every conversation was also a matter of friend raising, right? It was a matter of community building too, right? Because even if, some of those conversations maybe didn't yield resources straight away, I think, people thought about the other resources and connections and networks and, even professional background and experience that they could lend to the project. We had a tremendous amount of pro bono legal support on this project. And that was part of one of these building conversations. So yeah, just as an example. Yeah, but I would say my own alignment and the alignment that we were able to cultivate just in some of those conversations, those building conversations, really cemented a belief in the project that made it possible for myself and others to really enlist their extended networks in the vision of Restore Oakland and fight that uphill battle to bring the project to life.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, you made me think of two things. So one is that when you were talking about Uber buying the Sears building, one thing that really struck me is just EBC was always on the move, right? We had moved 9 times in, at that time, about 20 years. And so to finally have a permanent home also created just like a really like strong, stable place for us to be able to land and just be and not worry about, will we have a place to organize next year, right? And so allowing kind of also like the cognitive relief of that, I think, has been noticeable among our leadership. And then the second piece you named, I think about the heart side of this, especially in an election year, and fighting bad bills in the Capitol. It's like there's always going to be bad stuff, and whoever wins, like, it matters to us materially, but we will always be here, right? Like we will continue to be able to be rooted in the Fruitvale because we have this space. So yeah, allowing for our longevity and like creating hope and remembering that there will be a future beyond 2024. Knock on wood, and all that, but there's a future for us, and we're building it. Christina, the next question is for you. Now, we wrapped up the actual writing a couple months ago, and so I'd just love to hear what sticks out to you as possibly the biggest benefit to nonprofit and community development groups as they're reading through the case study.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ash, for having me and for that question. I think in the social justice and movement organizing space, we are, as Zach was talking about this earlier, we are visionaries, dreamers, doers, and that's a very comfortable space for us to be in, right? We're often fighting against the status quo, subverting the way that systems and society think that things should be. But there's a real practical set of activities and solutions that are needed to take those dreams and make them into reality. And I think and hope that this case study really outlines all of those practical to-dos and lessons learned of what's really needed to be lined up to make those dreams into reality. EBC and partners, and some of these examples have already been provided by Jocelyn and Zach, but EBC leveraged tons of resources, technical partners, consultants, and services to make this work. It wasn't just like, oh, let's do this, and then it happened, right? It was sometimes flying blind and bringing in resources later, or just pushing and getting it done, because that's what we often do in this space, and figuring out how to fund or pay for it later. And sometimes, that came at a cost, I think, specifically to the kind of burnout rate of staff. And I think the case study was really honest about those different activities that were needed and the pressures and kind of lessons learned for folks who are considering this. But, just off the top of my head, when I'm thinking about some of those resources, already mentioned was, the feasibility study, a pre-campaign fundraising feasibility study. There was a planning grant, multiple community input studies, canvassing of the neighborhood, hiring a project director, getting a real estate and development firm, a business planning consultant, a management company, on-site facilities manager, multiple 501c3s, right? I mean, those are all named and detailed in the report in a way that I hope allows people to really make a real plan, build in the full costs of the project into an initial budget, identify and line up key resources, plan and prepare staff, and launch a project in a realistic timeline. Things will always shift. There's always the unexpected. That happened with this campaign. It happens in any campaign. As the comment you quoted Jocelyn is saying earlier, one capital campaign is just one capital campaign. But I think, the case study does a remarkably good job of that. And I'll say that the specificity, there's some stuff that we wanted to include on some of those resources around what worked particularly well around those resources that organizations should really think about in vetting and bringing those folks on. So for example, designing justice, designing spaces was already mentioned as the real estate development and architecture firm that was engaged. I mean, talk about a unicorn firm that exists that focuses primarily on restorative justice spaces and re-envisioning, a future that is more restorative and creating healing spaces. And they have an entire approach that's dedicated to ensuring that community voice is at the center of that design process, right? Such a natural fit for the partners and for the vision that was described for Restore Oakland. Not everyone listening may be wanting to build a restorative justice space. Certainly if they were, DJDS would be a great place to go. But really thinking about, are there real estate development and architecture firms who get your work and who understand what you're trying to do and trying to find that values alignment as much as possible? Another kind of lesson learned, capital campaign consultant. There wasn't a full-time capital campaign consultant when this thing started, right? EBC and ROC were drawing down from development directors that were already raising money for the operating support for those organizations. And
Sorry, Jocelyn.
soon, Zach's like, sorry, Zach. But that, hire a capital campaign consultant from the start. So anyways, I could go on and on, but I do think and hope that the case study provides a lot of those practical lessons for folks to really go into a campaign like this with eyes wide open.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I agree. It feels like the tangible pieces of this are the things that I hope that folks can learn. And we can't say any louder. Hire someone to work on this. Hire an external consultant, please, please, please.
And shout out to Jocelyn for the foresight and just capacity to say, hey, this is something that's needed. I'm actually proposing this. Like that's how a lot of things happen. We're like, this would be good if we had a capital campaign consultant. I'm gonna raise my hand for that. And help you find a development director. Like there were so many times where we were, what do they say? I don't ski, but like in over your skis or whatever. And people would come in and just say like, okay, you may not have noticed this, but it would be ideal if we did it this way. And so, yeah, just wanted to say that, say thank you to Jocelyn.
Thanks.
Appreciate you, Zach. It's all good.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Jocelyn, would love to toss it to you. Anything you can offer to folks on the call about juggling the different fundraising elements of the campaign, maybe in addition to hiring someone? Yeah, specifically, like, how did you all as a team keep your fundraising goals and actually funds separated while maintaining focus?
Yeah, appreciate the question. And yeah, I mean, I think Christina, I really appreciate the you just kind of candidly sharing like this is hard work. And I think the report is really honest and kind of spelling out the different components of that, because it's one thing to know that just kind of in a general sense, but to drill down and actually talk about all the different components of a project and all the different steps that needed to be taken in order to make this happen, I think is rightfully sobering, right? Like, you know, when I have the privilege of working with many groups that are doing land-based projects and capital campaigns, and, you know, I never try to sugarcoat it, right? It is really important work and very consistent with the visions of many of our movements. And it's the real deal. It's hard work. It's going to be the biggest lift you've ever done, right? So yeah, I think the headline is that it's really hard. And my advice to others contemplating a similar project is to plan ahead to the extent you can for the additional capacity you'll need, and beyond that, to have regular checkpoints, maybe, right? At which you're really sitting down with the team and reevaluating the capacity and staying power of your people, right? Right, because there's all the hard stuff that we were doing together at EBC and related to Restore Oakland, and then there's like life happening in the background, and you know, the heartbreak of what it means to be in movement work often, right? And that stays with us too. So I think yeah, it's important to have those checkpoints, right? That's what I'll call them. Operationally speaking, I think having strong accounting practices, good finance people, good fundraising people, right? Establishing separate business entities and bank accounts is, of course, all very wise. What's harder, I'd say, is accounting for sweat equity and the division of time and labor on a capital campaign involving more than one owning organization. It's really important to plan for, hire, and retain the skilled people you'll need for the life of the project, and to be clear about when that is something given in kind or in the form of sweat equity to the project by one of the owning organizations, and when that is something that is separately done through a new organizational entity. So just keeping track of things in a way that is consistent with agreements that are made in advance. Yeah, so I served as the development director for EBC for 2 years before transitioning to serve as a full-time capital campaign director for Restore Oakland. And as Christina alluded to, you know, leading up to that transition, I was co-leading Restore Oakland campaign with the development director at ROC. And with both of us having our attention divided between the campaign, general fundraising responsibilities, and often concurrent campaigns, right? So, for example, ROC was also raising millions of dollars at the time to advance a couple of one fair wage ballot initiatives across the country. Zach, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the initiative fights started way back then, finally crossed the finish line with a big court victory in Michigan. So big congratulations. to
Yeah, shout out, shout
ours.
out. Yeah,
Yeah.
the Republicans tried to overturn it, and then it got not overturned, so it is happening. Yeah, but yeah, that was a huge deal and a big lift. You're right at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, right, these are the things that like policy advocacy organizations, organizing folks like who are mobilizing bases and fighting in the courts and fighting in the streets and fighting in our state capitals, right? Like that work never stopped while we were doing this for both organizations involved. And by necessity, that was the core of our work. That's what we had to keep doing. And there was also this other very high priority thing happening alongside it all. So, I think that's just something to take into account because, there's no way not to have your attention, your capacity, your time, your energies pulled in all different kinds of directions, even while you're trying to do this new and bigger extra thing that involves a lot of learning curves, right? But yeah, back to the question at hand, I think definitely a challenge to keep EBC strong and growing while also absorbing, the ever-growing campaign fundraising needs. And yeah, one thing I'll say is that the financial health and stability of EBC was also rightfully a concern to many of our funders, right? So beyond keeping the lights on and our people paid for the core of our work, we also needed to show EBC's financial strength in order to reassure funders that they could also give to Restore Oakland without risking some type of cannibalizing of the organization, so to speak. From the time I started at EBC to when I left, Zach, myself, and the team grew EBC's operating reserve from 5 months to 32 months, all while growing the team and the scope of our core programming. What can I say? When you're in charge of raising money, you keep receipts, right? But, that ended up being really important for the success of Restore Oakland. There were moments when EBC needed to put additional capital from its reserves into Restore Oakland to keep the project from stagnating, right? And today still, I'm really proud to see that EBC and, its good name, its resource mobilization muscles, are keeping the building in good repair and a home for all that was dreamed up nearly over a decade ago, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Appreciate that. Yeah, and I would say one thing I think I learned through all of you is you can make a budget, but then you should probably just double it or maybe triple it and have that be your goal. So just a thing to keep in mind. And actually in 2019, the year that the Capitol campaign closed, there was an article that went through all the local newspapers about how the Bay Area was actually the #1 most expensive place in the world to do construction. So I was glad to have read that after we closed the campaign, I will say. Christina, would love to hear from you a little bit more. You've talked about the concrete tools that the project leveraged, all the feasibility studies. And I'm curious if there's a specific chapter or concept you'd love for other organizations to really key in on as they read through the report.
Yeah, so the case study really focused on like 4 key sections. The first was like the origin story and the planning concept development phase, and then what it takes to buy, build, and manage a property. The third was building strong partnership models, and the fourth was raising capital. So it's hard to pick. I'll say like all of them are important for this type of effort. But, I already kind of spoke to like all the practical advice that you'll find in the document. But I'd really encourage people to focus on the origin story. All 3 of you, Zach, Jocelyn, Ash, were all speaking to the why behind Restore Oakland. And we talk about that a bit in the case study around really there being this confluence of factors that made buying this building and naming it Restore Oakland the right decision for Ella Baker Center and its partners at the time. And, we've already talked about the practical side of that. The rent was too damn high. Nonprofits are being displaced from their spaces all the time. Most of the money that funds nonprofits for the services they provide, don't like paying for rent or facilities management or other kind of overhead expenses. And then there's the dreaming side. There's the buying a building to establish roots in a community, create an asset, and a place that can be, in Marlene's words, like a political home for community members in the future, to allow partners to build a vision for community care that directly confronts and upends the carceral state and its vision of control and command. To build a space, a restaurant for entrepreneurs and job training and all of that. And the reality is that the buying, redeveloping, owning, and operating a building is not for the faint of heart, right? As we've all been saying, it requires adapting your organizational capacity and values, to the context of being an owner and a landlord of commercial space and all the power dynamics and practical needs that come with that role. So I think making sure that that origin story is clear to you and to all of your people, making sure you're very clear on your why, um, is incredibly important to make all of this work worthwhile, to be able to get your partners and your staff excited about it, to talk to the community about it, to get your funders, to really believe in the work. To a point that was previously mentioned, one of the funders that we spoke to said, like, they just believed deeply that EBC had developed a solution that was responding to the context in Oakland, that this solution may not have been a solution for other communities, but it was so Oakland rooted and Oakland specific and Oakland led, that's what really wanted them to give. And they gave in a significant way. So really think about that local community context, speak the language of your community, and make sure that you're very clear about that. For some organizations, the practical need of not being displaced again and just having a place where you can have your programs running is good enough. And that makes enough of a case. And that's cool. You don't necessarily need to have, I didn't hear from people like they needed all the big dreams and wishes. The dreams and wishes came from the community members and from the folks who were in these organizations who wanted to see these spaces created. And that's wonderful. That community asset and the flavors of that was something that was unique to us. And so if you're going to make sure to do this, just making sure that that vision is in alignment with those community needs is just essential part of that.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, definitely critical to have everything centered on what the community needs, what we need, how we can work together to achieve those things. Zach, sometimes when we undertake work in movement spaces, we don't become fully aware of the impact of our efforts for many years. So now that we're able to kind of look back at Restore Oakland, at the building, what's something that you've only realized after some time about the importance of EBC having their own building? And what's something you can let other organizations know about that would benefit them that they might not realize are part of the upside of owning a building?
Right on. I appreciate that. I mean, I think when I first saw that question, it brought me back to, some of what we've talked about already in terms of the organization being bounced around the Bay Area like 9 times in our 20-year history. And that wasn't just like an abstraction for me. Like, I was born in 1977 in San Francisco. We moved to Oakland when I was a week old. Most of my family have been displaced out of San Francisco. My dad helped me buy a home across the street from my mom in 2005. And that Great Recession that Jocelyn talked about that hit nonprofits in the mid 2010s hit me right away. We were underwater on our loan and at risk of losing our home. And I remember working at the Ella Baker Center as an organizer and also at the same time fighting to try to keep my house. And I'll never forget doing a protest. It was me, Saru, Robbie from Cause a Hoosier Just Cause, and an intern from Cause a Hoosier Just Cause in front of like this giant 100-story building trying to protest that they were gonna take our house. And luckily Matt Nelson at Cause a Hoosier Just Cause had gotten the VP's number, and people were calling in. So even though we thought this protest was completely unsuccessful, we actually got them to give us a an application for a readjustment to our loan. And so I was able to stay in my home in Oakland. And as Jocelyn was naming, like it was an ongoing question whether or not Black people in particular, I feel like, would have been able to stay in Oakland at that time, given some of the gentrification and rising commercial rates as well as housing rates. And it's still an ongoing question that we're fighting, right? But you can't win as a community institution. You can't call yourself a community institution if you're kicked out of the community, right? And so Restore Oakland was a critical vehicle to be able to say that a different vision of Oakland is possible, one in which we're able to stay here. As folks at the Black Liberation Zone says, you know, keep you know, we need to be able to damn, I'm forgetting the slogan, but like loving our neighbors and our neighborhood and wanting to see a better neighborhood with the same neighbors in it, right? Like I feel like that was something that we were really advocating for, is to be able to stay rooted in Oakland and then to put forward a different vision of what community safety would look like. And that to me was a big part of the elevator pitch, is everybody was talking about let's, at this time, and it's kind of hard to remember now, but people were talking seriously about how do we end mass incarceration. And we knew that in order that we couldn't just stop the bad, we had to stop the bad, change the rules, and build the good, as one of my mentors, Taj James, talks about. And in order to be able to build the good, you actually have to show people what you mean. And so that, for me, was what Restore Oakland was about and is about, is putting forward a different vision of what community safety looks like and creating that political home. The last thing I'll say is that in the process of building that political home, you get a lot of new homies who you might not expect. And Jocelyn and Christina have named this. Like, we didn't know about new market tax credits or commercial real estate or so many things. And that's that friend raising aspect where we got connected to Community Vision, formerly Northern California Community Loan Fund. We got connected to Jerry Jai and Jason at Ebalsi, who, without whom which this project would not have happened. Like both the Ella Baker Center and Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, and I think Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, this was kind of our first rodeo. We were really feeling it out and figuring out. We weren't skilled in any of those technical aspects. We had the dream and we had the vision, and we were developing the know-how, but we were thankfully able to connect with folks like Jerry Jai and Ebalsi and BBI Construction, Laleen Mitchell and others, and they were able to help guide us through a process of what is it going to look like? How do you manage time, money, resources, that triangle? When things stretch, where do you stretch? How do you figure out how to keep the project going without it completely derailing? And to Jocelyn's point, taking a couple nonprofits down with it in the process, right? Because that's the opposite of the goal. The goal is really to build something that is stronger, that is more connected, and that is demonstrating what's possible when we come together, that we can actually respond to each other in times of crisis, whether they be economic crisis or conflict and violence in communities. We were really showing that there was a different way to be in community, and that's something that I think is still a hugely important, tangible asset in Oakland and beyond.
Yeehaw. Thank you, Zach. Really appreciate you sharing and laying into all of that good wisdom with us. This last question is for everybody on the panel. And Jocelyn, if you're game, I'd love to start with you. What's one last thing you want to make sure we share? What do you want folks to take away from today?
Yeah, thanks, Ash, for this time. Thank you, Christina and Zach, for this conversation. I think the one thing I always say about my experience with Restore Oakland is that it was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had. I grew so much. And I think everybody involved grew so much, right? We were just hitting learning edge, learning curve, growth edge at every turn. And that was hard, don't get me wrong. And I think the report details a lot of the ways in which that was hard. And also, wow, talk about leveling up, right? On an individual level, on a team level, on an organizational level, on a movement level, right? So yeah, both there's some scars, no doubt, but there's also so many new muscles and capacities and space in my heart. And so yeah, really, really grateful to all of you and for this project's existence. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Christina, could I pass it to you?
Yeah, sure. This has been such a great conversation, and there's so much to say, but I think given everything that we've said, really just, for folks to increase risk tolerance in the nonprofit sector, this is something I think I talked about with all of you, but, nonprofit sector does not reward risk taking. Funders and organizational leaders, they want to see nonprofits minimize risks and shepherd their precious resources very, very carefully. And that's in stark contrast to the private sector, where risk is rewarded in, are the society that relies on capitalism and risk is lauded as kind of the seed of innovation. And in this case, the decision to buy this building was a riskier venture than the partners were used to taking. And that risk paid off at the end and will continue to pay off as this building lives and grows and continues to deepen its roots in the fruit veil. But I think, figuring out how to build that muscle early on, and part of that is probably contingency planning, like coming up with, if this thing doesn't happen, what's our backup plan, right? What are other options for us to be able to continue to do this? I think that's the piece that will allow staff to continue to have the focus and comfort to do what they need to do to make it happen. And, that will also provide the kind of transparency and clarity that your funders will want to see as you embark on a process like this.
I'll jump in. Just building off of that, like, I think in addition to risk being kind of rewarded, it's also that private capital has their mistakes and their externalities heaped on top of, and their harms heaped on top of communities in ways that make the status quo inherently risky and unsustainable and awful for most communities. And I think of like the PG&E fires, where it was knowable that those fires were going to cause damage. And so my call to philanthropists is to correctly assess risks and responsibilities in ways that allow us to scale up the vision of something that would truly be sustainable for all. And I think the next charge for Restore Oakland and Black Liberation Zone and the work that Courage, Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice, just to name a few groups in the Bay Area, is doing is how do we continue to like scale up and build out that vision of the world we need? Because I feel like politicians have gotten more savvy at continuing the bad, saying they're changing the rules, and building little, on the margins, versions of the good that is insufficient. I see that in the climate sector, see that in the context of the criminal legal system, and what Jocelyn named about like continuing to do that advocacy work, even as we were building this new thing, is very much necessary and continues to be necessary. And funders should be thinking about, and philanthropists should be thinking about all aspects of that. Stop the bad, change the rules, build the good, because none of those things by themselves will be sufficient. And I think it's on us as a sector as a whole to level up and to be able to walk and chew gum and do some of those three things simultaneously, because our communities uh, um, depend on our success in that endeavor.
That's right. Thank you all so much. And I just want to echo this thing that Zach is naming of, we're up against a lot. We have a huge fight ahead of us. And so when we're able to be invested in, when folks are able to trust the vision, the dream, the action, that's how we're going to be able to move forward and secure the freedom that our communities actually deserve. So thank you so, so much, Christina, Jocelyn, and Zach. Your perspectives today have been extra brilliant, and so I just deeply appreciate everything you've been sharing. And for everyone, as you've seen today, Restore Oakland is proof that we don't need the systems we're trying to tear down. We just need each other. And so as we think about next steps, we're moving in partnership with our beloved community. We intend for Restore Oakland to continue proving these ideas into the future well beyond the 5th anniversary. So now here's the fun part, right? Let's talk about ways to stay in touch. As with all good organizing, we have a few calls to action for you today. So first, I'll just we'll share out a copy of the case study. It's also in the chat. And we'll also share out the recording at the end of this call. So please use it. Please feel free to share this with anyone who might benefit from it. Our goal really is to be able to share out lessons learned. So spread it far and wide. This is for us. Second, we'll be having a Restore Oakland celebration of our 5th anniversary on October 1st. It'll be from 5 to 7 p.m. It'll be so fun. Understory is catering, and we're going to have DJ Davey come through. So Matt will send the link in the chat, but it would be great to see you here, see you there if you're local. And finally, Restore Oakland has been a place for action for 5 years now. And with the right support, we can keep being a launching pad for movements. So if you or folks you know are interested in supporting Restore Oakland's continued work, please do reach out. We know many folks are here today because you're thinking about your own capital campaigns, and we really do hope that this has been helpful. Please keep us in your community with any news you have about your own projects, and any exciting community development plans that are coming down the pike. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.